What if Alexander the Great had lived longer? An alternate history concept. A dream or a possible reality. History is always viewed through the lens of what has already happened, but sometimes it's important to ask, what if it had unfolded differently? What if the key moments of history had gone in another direction? This is where alternate history comes in, a genre where we explore different scenarios that could have shaped the world in completely new ways. Imagine, for a moment, it's the 4th century BC. Alexander the Great, at just 32 years of age, has already conquered much of the known world, from Greece to Egypt, Persia to India. But before he can solidify his empire, Alexander dies suddenly in Babylon. Now imagine if Alexander had lived longer. What would have happened if he had lived to conquer even more lands? How might the world have looked different if his empire had expanded even further? Could Alexander have reached China, the Far East, or even crossed into the Americas? What lasting cultural and political impacts would he have left behind? Let's delve into this alternate history and explore what could have happened if Alexander the Great had lived longer. What actually happened in history? Alexander's brief yet monumental reign is one of the most significant periods in history. Born in 356 BC in Macedonia, he inherited a powerful army from his father, King Philip II. By the time he was 20, he had already proven himself as a brilliant military commander. In 334 BC, Alexander began his campaign against the Persian Empire, eventually conquering it by 331 BC. He then pushed further east, reaching the Indus River in India by 326 BC. However, despite his incredible successes, his troops, weary from years of constant campaigning, refused to march any further. Alexander was forced to turn back. Sadly, in 323 BC, Alexander died suddenly in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, likely from a fever, though the exact cause is still debated. His death marked the end of his grand vision of a unified empire stretching from Greece to the farthest reaches of Asia. What if Alexander had lived longer? Now let's consider a different scenario. What if Alexander had survived past the age of 32? What would have happened if he had lived to continue his conquests? 1. Conquering the Far East. If Alexander had lived longer, it's likely that he would have continued his push eastward, potentially reaching the lands of China and the Far East. The Great Wall of China was built during this time, and Alexander's legendary ambition might have led him into conflict or alliances with the Chinese states. Perhaps Alexander's empire would have expanded across Asia, creating an unprecedented global empire that stretched from Greece to the shores of the Pacific. Second expansion into Africa and the Americas. What if Alexander had turned his attention to the African continent, exploring deeper into the heart of the continent? His forces could have established colonies in regions like Nubia and beyond, reshaping the cultural and political landscape of Africa. And what if Alexander had reached the Americas? While it seems unlikely, his adventurous nature and curiosity about the world might have led him to cross the Atlantic, potentially meeting the indigenous civilizations of the Americas centuries before the European explorers. 3. A united East and West. One of the most fascinating aspects of Alexander's vision was his belief in blending Eastern and Western cultures. He sought to create a melting pot of ideas, religions, and traditions. Had he lived longer, he might have been able to fully integrate his empire, spreading Hellenistic culture further into Asia and creating a true East-West unity. This could have had profound effects on the development of science, philosophy, and art, fostering a golden age of intellectual achievement that could have lasted for centuries. The influence on Rome and future empires. Alexander's death had a direct influence on the formation of the Roman Empire. His generals, the Diadochi, fought amongst themselves for control of his empire, leading to its division. However, had Alexander lived longer, he could have potentially prevented the fragmentation of his empire. His continued reign might have delayed or even prevented the rise of Rome as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. This would have had a massive impact on the political and cultural development of Europe and the Mediterranean world. The cultural and political impact of a longer Alexander reign. 1. Cultural integration. Alexander was known for promoting the blending of cultures across his vast empire. He encouraged intermarriage between Greeks and Persians and spread Greek culture throughout his conquered territories. Had he lived longer, this policy could have been carried out on an even larger scale. Greek architecture, art, philosophy, and governance could have become even more influential in Asia and Africa, leaving a lasting legacy. 2. A more stable and diverse empire. While Alexander's empire was short-lived, it was incredibly diverse, encompassing people of various ethnicities, languages, and religions. If Alexander had lived longer, he may have been able to establish a more stable and unified empire by implementing reforms that recognized and celebrated this diversity. His reign might have prevented the chaotic fragmentation that occurred after his death, and a more cohesive empire could have formed with stronger foundations in governance and law. 3. The role of religion. Alexander also showed interest in the religions of the lands he conquered, adopting Persian and Egyptian religious practices and presenting himself as a divine ruler. If he had lived longer, he may have further integrated these religious traditions into his rule, creating a more syncretic religious environment. This might have altered the religious landscape of the ancient world, potentially blending Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and other religious traditions into a unified belief system. What would the modern world look like? A longer reign of Alexander would have drastically changed the trajectory of history. Let's imagine how this might affect the modern world. First, European influence. Alexander's influence on Europe would have been even stronger. If the Hellenistic world had lasted longer, it could have profoundly influenced the development of Europe. The spread of Greek language, philosophy, and governance might have shaped the foundations of European civilization. The Renaissance, for instance, might have happened much earlier, with a greater blending of Greek, Egyptian, and Persian influences. 2. Science and philosophy. A longer-lasting Hellenistic empire would have likely fostered a greater exchange of knowledge. The scientific and philosophical advancements of the Greeks, Egyptians, and Persians could have combined to create an intellectual golden age. Think of a world where ancient Greek and Persian scientists worked side by side, creating a scientific revolution centuries ahead of its time. The development of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics could have occurred much earlier, leading to advancements that would have shaped the modern world in profound ways. The formation of a global empire. If Alexander had lived longer, he may have been able to forge the first truly global empire, one that stretched across Europe, Asia, and Africa. This could have changed the political landscape of the ancient world, potentially preventing the rise of later empires like Rome or Persia. Instead, a unified empire stretching from Greece to the Indian subcontinent could have laid the foundations for a new world order with a more interconnected global society. What would have been the legacy of a longer reign? While Alexander the Great's early death may have limited his empire's potential, a longer reign would have altered the course of history in ways we can only imagine. He could have created a lasting empire that united East and West, blending cultures, religions, and ideas in ways that might have created a more stable and prosperous world. His influence on the ancient world could have been even greater, reshaping the course of history in ways that are difficult to comprehend. The world today may have been a very different place if Alexander had lived longer. What do you think? How do you imagine the world would have turned out if Alexander the Great had lived longer? Would it have been a more united, enlightened world? Or would the challenges of empire building have led to a different kind of conflict? Share your thoughts in the comments below.